The alarms were still screaming when they dragged me through the steel doors, and I remember thinking that if I moved even one finger too fast, the men holding the rifles would end me right there in the hallway. My wrists burned where the black cuffs pressed into my skin. They were not ordinary restraints. Every step I took, I felt my strength drain out of me, like water through cracked stone. Whatever metal they had built those chains from, it was made for someone like me, someone they were terrified of. I did not fight them. Fighting would have proven every terrible thing they already believed. The hallway was cold, lit by white lights that buzzed faintly above my head. Soldiers lined both sides, their faces hard, their eyes following me the way you would watch a fire that had not yet decided whether to spread. Nobody spoke to me. Nobody looked at me for longer than a second. I was something to be moved, processed, and locked away, not something to be greeted. A tall man in a dark green uniform walked ahead of the group. He did not turn around once. I would later learn his name was Colonel Hale, and that he was the one who had given the order to bring me here, instead of ending things on the field where they found me. I did not know, back then, whether that was mercy or simply caution. They brought me to a room with a single chair bolted to the floor, and a wall made of reinforced glass on one side. Through that glass, I could see rows of monitors, screens filled with numbers I did not understand, and men in white coats speaking quietly to each other while pointing in my direction. I sat where they told me to sit. The chains around my wrists were connected to a thick loop bolted into the floor, and my ankles were locked the same way. I remember staring down at my own hands, wondering how something as simple as metal could make me feel this small. A woman in a lab coat stepped closer to the glass. She did not come inside. Nobody came inside unless they absolutely had to. She studied me, the way a person studies a storm on the horizon, trying to guess how bad it will get before it arrives. I wanted to tell her I was not what she thought. I wanted to explain that the stories she had heard, whatever they were not the whole truth. But I said nothing. Explaining myself to people who had already decided what I was would have been like shouting into wind. Hours passed like that. I sat in silence while they watched me from behind glass, whispered about me in hallways, and adjusted machines that measured things about my body I did not fully understand myself. At some point, they must have decided I was not an immediate threat, because 2 guards came in, unlocked the loop on the floor, and pulled me up by the chains connecting my wrists. They walked me through another set of hallways, deeper into the building, past doors with warning symbols I recognized from human material I had studied long before I ever expected to end up here. The new room was smaller, a single bed frame without a mattress, a drain in the floor. A single light above me that never turned off, not even when they left. I did not sleep that first night. I do not think I was meant to. The next morning, or what I assumed was morning based on a change in the light outside a small barred window, they moved me again. This time, it was not to another cell, but to a transport vehicle, boxy and heavily armored, with narrow slits for windows near the top. I sat with my back against the cold metal wall as the vehicle began to move. 2 guards sat across from me, weapons resting on their laps, never quite pointed at me, but never far from it either. Through the narrow window slit, I caught glimpses of the outside world. Gray buildings, rows of fencing topped with wire, uniforms everywhere. It was strange, seeing a world I had only known through reports and warnings, now passing by in fragments through a few inches of reinforced glass. The vehicle slowed as it approached a large gate, and that was when I saw them. 3 girls, none of them older than perhaps 10 or 11 years, stood near a small building that looked like it might belong to families living on the base. They should not have been anywhere near a transport carrying someone like me. I assumed at first that they simply did not know what was inside the vehicle. But then the transport stopped for a moment, waiting for the gate to open, and one of the girls looked directly at the window slit, right at me. She did not scream. She did not run. She did not call for an adult the way I expected. She simply looked at me, tilted her head slightly, the way children do when they see something they do not understand, but are not yet afraid of, and then she raised one small hand and waved. I did not move. I did not know how to respond to something so simple after a day filled with fear, restraints, and silence. One of the guards across from me followed my gaze, saw the girls through the slit, and muttered something under his breath about them needing to be kept away from the transport routes. He knocked on the wall to signal the driver to continue moving. As the vehicle rolled forward, I kept my eyes on that narrow window until the girls disappeared from view. The other two girls had been watching as well, whispering to each other, but it was the one who waved that stayed in my mind. I did not understand it then, but something about that small gesture cracked something open inside me that all the chains in the world had not been able to touch. The new facility was larger than the first. It sat behind 3 layers of fencing, with guard towers positioned at intervals along the perimeter. Inside, it looked less like a prison, and more like a strange combination of a military base and a small town. There were buildings for soldiers, buildings for scientists, and smaller buildings near the back that I assumed belonged to families of the staff who lived and worked there. They gave me a cell, in a section built specifically to hold me. The walls were lined with the same strength-dampening material as my chains. A single window near the ceiling let in a thin strip of daylight. It was not comfortable, but compared to where I had spent the previous night, it felt almost livable. Dr. Bennett was the first person who spoke to me directly, instead of through glass or across a room. She was a small woman, with sharp eyes and gray hair pulled back tightly. She stood a respectful distance from the bars of my cell and introduced herself in a calm, even voice, as if greeting a difficult patient rather than a captured enemy. I answered her questions carefully: where I came from, what I could do, why I had been where I was found. I gave her true answers, but not the whole truth. Not yet. Some things I was not ready to say out loud, not to someone who worked for the people who now controlled every part of my life. She left after nearly an hour, saying she would return the next day. As she walked away, I noticed she paused near the exit and looked back at me once, her expression unreadable. That night, as I lay on the thin cot they had given me, staring at the dim strip of stars visible through my small window, I thought again about the girl who had waved. I told myself it meant nothing. Children were curious about strange things. That was all it was. But some quiet part of me, the part that had spent so long being feared, being hunted, being seen only as a weapon, held on to that small wave like it was something precious. I did not know yet that it was only the beginning. 3 days passed before I saw the girl again, and this time she was not alone. It happened during the hour they allowed me outside my cell, walking in small circles inside a fenced yard attached to the back of the holding building. A single guard named Ethan stood watch nearby, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his eyes more tired than hostile. He was young, younger than most of the soldiers I had seen so far, and he rarely spoke to me beyond short instructions. I was standing near the fence, looking out at the rows of family housing in the distance, when I noticed movement between 2 buildings. 3 small shapes ducked behind a wall, peeking out every few seconds like they were playing some kind of game. I recognized the one who had waved immediately. Her hair was the color of dry wheat, tied back in a loose braid. Beside her stood a girl with darker skin and short curly hair, and another smaller girl who kept glancing nervously toward the guard towers. Ethan did not seem to notice them at first, his attention focused on a data pad in his hand. I kept my movements slow and unremarkable, not wanting to draw his gaze toward the fence where the girls were hiding. The braided girl crept closer, staying low, until she was crouched just on the other side of the fence, only a few steps from where I stood. Up close, she looked even younger than I had guessed, maybe 9 years old, with wide, curious eyes that held none of the fear I had grown used to seeing in adults. "Hi," she whispered, glancing quickly toward Ethan, before looking back at me. "I'm Lily." I did not answer right away. Speaking to a child through a fence, with armed guards nearby and cameras I assumed were watching my every movement, felt like a mistake waiting to happen. But something about her open expression made it hard to simply stay silent. "You should not be here," I said quietly, keeping my voice low enough that only she could hear it. "It is not safe." Lily tilted her head, unbothered by the warning. "Why not? You're not going to hurt me." "You do not know that." "Yeah, I do," she said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "You didn't do anything when we passed you in the truck. You just looked sad." I had not expected that word, sad. Not dangerous, not frightening, not monstrous, sad. Before I could respond, the other 2 girls crept closer as well. The one with curly hair introduced herself as Grace, and the smallest, who barely spoke above a whisper, was Ava. They crouched together near the fence like a small group of scouts on a secret mission, occasionally glancing back toward the guard tower with nervous excitement. "We're not supposed to be over here," Grace admitted, grinning slightly despite her own words. "Then you should go," I said, though I made no move to call for Ethan or draw attention to them. "In a minute," Lily said, reaching into a small bag she carried and pulling out a folded piece of paper. She pushed it carefully through a narrow gap at the bottom of the fence. "I made this for you." I hesitated before picking it up. Unfolding it revealed a child's drawing, simple lines and bright colors, showing a figure with long hair standing beside three smaller figures, all holding hands beneath a yellow sun. I did not know what to say. Nobody, since I had been taken, had given me anything that was not a chain, a question, or a warning. I stared at the paper for a long moment, feeling something tighten in my chest that I did not have a name for. "You didn't have to do that," I finally managed. "I wanted to," Lily said simply. Ava, the quietest of the three, finally spoke up, her voice barely above a breath. "Are you really from another planet?" "Yes," I said. "Does it hurt, the chains?" The question caught me off guard, mostly because none of the adults had asked me that, not even Dr. Bennett with all her careful questions. I looked down at the cuffs around my wrists, the metal that dulled everything I once was. "Sometimes," I admitted. Ava's small face crumpled slightly, as though the answer upset her more than she expected. Grace put a comforting hand on her shoulder, the kind of gesture that told me these three had been friends for a long time, used to looking out for each other. A sound near the guard tower made all three girls freeze. Ethan had looked up from his datapad, scanning the yard out of habit. The girls ducked low, pressing themselves against the fence, and I quickly stepped back to my previous position, keeping my expression neutral. Ethan's eyes swept over the yard, paused briefly near the fence, then returned to his datapad, apparently satisfied that nothing was out of place. The girls waited several long seconds before daring to move again. "We should go," Grace whispered. Lily nodded, but lingered a moment longer, looking at me through the fence with an expression far too serious for someone her age. "We'll come back," she said, like a promise. "You should not," I said again, though my voice lacked the conviction it needed to actually stop her. "We will anyway," she said, and then the three of them scurried off between the buildings, disappearing as quickly as they had come. I stood there for a long moment, the drawing still clutched carefully in my hand, hidden against my palm where the cameras would not easily catch sight of it. That night, back in my cell, I unfolded the paper again and studied it under the thin strip of light from the window. The figure they had drawn to represent me had a small smile on its face, something I had not worn in longer than I wanted to admit. I found a loose section of fabric beneath my cot and tucked the drawing there, hidden but close, a small piece of warmth in a place built entirely from cold metal and colder suspicion. Dr. Bennett visited again the next day, along with a stern-looking man I had not seen before, introduced only as Major Voss. Where Bennett's questions were careful and searching, Voss's were sharp, almost accusatory, as though he were trying to catch me in a lie before I had even finished a sentence. "Tell me again why your people attacked the outer colonies," Voss said, arms crossed, standing just outside the reach of my cell bars. "I did not attack anyone," I said evenly. "I was not part of that." Convenient answer. It is the true one. Voss studied me for a long moment, clearly unconvinced, before turning to Bennett and muttering something about tightening security around my cell block. Bennett said nothing in response, though I caught her glancing at me with an expression that was harder to read than Voss's obvious distrust. After they left, I sat alone in the silence, thinking about how easily people believed the worst version of a story, especially when that story came wrapped in fear. 2 days passed without any sign of the girls, and I told myself it was for the best. Whatever strange comfort their visit had given me, it was not worth the risk if they were caught. I did not know what punishment the base might have for children sneaking near a restricted holding area, but I doubted it would be pleasant for anyone involved, including me. But on the third evening, during my hour in the yard, I heard a familiar whisper near the fence. "Psst." I turned to find Lily, crouched in the same spot as before, this time alone. She held something wrapped in cloth against her chest. "You should not be here," I said, though the words felt weaker each time I spoke them. "I know," she said, unbothered. I brought you something." She pushed the cloth bundle through the gap at the bottom of the fence. I picked it up carefully and unwrapped it to find a small folded blanket, soft and worn from use, clearly something that had belonged to her for a long time. "I can't take this," I said, trying to push it back toward her. "You're cold at night," Lily said simply. "I heard my mom talking about it. She said the cells don't have heaters because they're worried you'll use the wires or something." I stared at the blanket, then at the girl on the other side of the fence, who seemed entirely unbothered by the idea that she was giving away one of her own comforts to someone the rest of the base viewed as dangerous. "Why are you doing this?" I asked quietly. Lily shrugged, the way children do, when a question seems far too complicated for a simple answer. "Because nobody else is being nice to you, and that seems wrong." I did not know how to respond to that. In all my years, through every version of fear I had experienced, from the empire that had once controlled my kind, to the humans who now held me in chains, nobody had ever offered kindness, as simply and plainly as this. "Thank you," I finally said, my voice quieter than I intended. Lily smiled, satisfied, and then glanced nervously toward the guard tower. "I have to go before Ethan sees me. He's nice, but he'd probably have to tell someone." Before she left, she pressed her small hand against the fence, fingers spread. After a moment of hesitation, I raised my own hand and pressed it against the other side, matching her fingers through the thin gaps in the metal. "I'll come back," she said again, and this time, I did not tell her not to. That night, wrapped in the small blanket she had given me, I allowed myself, for the first time since my capture, to believe that not every human on this base saw me as a monster. It was a dangerous thing to believe. Hope, I had learned long ago, could be more painful than chains when it was eventually taken away. But some nights, warmth is worth the risk. There are things about my past I had not told anyone on that base. Not Dr. Bennett with her careful notes, not Major Voss with his sharp accusations, and certainly not the guards who watched me with their hands never far from their weapons. I had not told them because the truth was not simple, and simple was the only thing fear ever wanted to hear. Long before I ever saw the blue and green world humans called home, I lived under the rule of an empire that did not see my people as citizens, or even as living things worth protecting. We were resources, tools, weapons to be shaped, trained, and deployed, wherever the empire needed force without consequence. From the time I was old enough to understand language, I was taught that my body was not entirely my own. The empire's scientists had altered generations of my kind long before I was born, giving us abilities meant for destruction, control, and conquest. We were not soldiers who chose to fight. We were instruments who had no choice in the matter at all. I remembered the training halls, cold and endless, where children barely old enough to walk were tested for how much power their bodies could withstand before breaking. I remembered watching others like me pushed past their limits, some never rising again from the training floor. I remembered the quiet terror of knowing that my own worth, in the eyes of those who controlled me, was measured entirely by how much destruction I could cause. When the Empire began its campaign against the outer colonies, the ones humans still spoke of with barely contained rage, my kind were sent ahead of every invasion. We were the first wave, the ones who broke defenses before the Empire's actual soldiers ever arrived. We did not choose the targets. We did not choose the timing. We were given commands through neural restraints embedded since childhood, restraints that made refusal nearly impossible without unbearable pain. I had been part of 3 such campaigns before the restraints in my mind finally began to fail, a rare defect the Empire's scientists never fully understood. It started as small moments of clarity, flashes where my own thoughts broke through the commands, long enough for me to feel the full weight of what I was being forced to do. By the time I broke free entirely, escaping during the chaos of a battle where my restraint failed completely, I had already been responsible for horrors I would carry for the rest of my life, horrors I never chose but could never fully separate myself from either. I fled through unclaimed space for months, avoiding both Empire patrols who wanted me recaptured or destroyed, and any inhabited systems where my presence might trigger the same fear I had seen etched into human reports about my kind. Eventually, running low on resources and options, I found myself drifting toward a human research outpost near the very edge of contested space, the same outpost where soldiers eventually found me, exhausted and unable to run any further. They saw a weapon that matched every warning in their old reports. They did not see someone running from the very empire that had made her a weapon in the first place. How could they? I had never been given the chance to explain, not in those first chaotic hours, and by the time anyone might have listened, fear had already decided the outcome. This was the truth I carried silently, while Lily and her friends visited me at the fence, while Dr. Bennett asked her careful questions, while Major Voss searched for confirmation of every dark assumption he already held. I did not know, sitting in that cell each night, whether the truth would ever matter to anyone who mattered. The days that followed Lily's gift of the blanket fell into an unexpected rhythm. She visited when she could, sometimes with Grace and Ava, sometimes alone, always careful to avoid the moments when guards were paying closest attention. I learned small things about her life during those visits. Her father worked in the base's engineering division, spending long hours maintaining the facility's power systems. Her mother worked alongside Dr. Bennett in the research labs, which explained how Lily had overheard details about my cell's lack of heating. She told me about her friends, about small disagreements between them that seemed enormous in the moment and forgotten within a day, about a garden her family kept near their housing unit where she grew small vegetables she was inordinately proud of. In turn, though I remained careful about the darker parts of my history, I told her about the world I had come from before the Empire changed everything, about skies that shifted colors depending on the season, about music that traveled through vibrations in stone rather than sound in air. It was strange, finding comfort in conversations with a child while adults around me debated whether I deserved to exist freely at all. But comfort, I was learning, did not always arrive from the places you expected. It began as an ordinary malfunction, the kind Ethan later told me happened occasionally in older sections of the base. A power surge in one of the engineering conduits, running beneath the family housing units, triggered a cascading failure, sparking a fire that spread faster than anyone expected through the aging wiring. I was in the yard for my evening hour when the alarms began, different from the ones I had heard during my capture. A sharper, more urgent tone that sent guards running in multiple directions at once. Ethan's radio crackled with frantic voices, reporting a fire near the housing sector, the same sector where Lily and her family lived. I felt something cold settle in my stomach, even before I fully understood why. Smoke began rising in the distance, thick and dark against the evening sky. Guards abandoned their usual careful distance from me, too focused on the emergency to spare much attention for the chained alien woman in the exercise yard. Ethan hesitated only a moment before running toward the source of the alarm, leaving me standing alone by the fence. I should have stayed exactly where I was. Every rule since my capture demanded it, but through the chaos of shouting voices and running figures, I heard something that made every instinct in my body override every ounce of caution I had carefully maintained. A child's voice, screaming. I did not think. I did not weigh consequences or calculate risks the way I normally forced myself to do in every interaction on this base. I simply moved, pulling against the chains connecting my wrists with a strength that sent sharp pain shooting through my arms as the dampening metal fought against me. The chains did not break, not entirely, but the sudden surge of desperate effort cracked the mechanism holding them to the loop embedded in the yard's fence post, giving me just enough freedom of movement to run. I sprinted toward the smoke, ignoring the shouts behind me, as guards finally noticed my movement and began scrambling to respond. I did not have time to explain myself. I did not have time to worry about how this would look. The housing sector was chaos when I arrived. Flames had engulfed part of a small building, smoke pouring from broken windows, families gathered at a safe distance, while a few brave adults attempted to organize a response with fire suppression equipment that seemed painfully inadequate against the size of the blaze. I scanned the crowd desperately, searching for a familiar braided head of hair, and my chest tightened painfully when I did not find her among the gathered families. "Lily!" I shouted, my voice cutting through the chaos. A woman near the front of the crowd turned toward me, her face pale with panic. It took me only a moment to recognize features similar to Lily's own. "She went back inside," the woman gasped, pointing toward the burning building with a trembling hand. "Ava dropped something. She went back to get her before I could stop her." I did not wait to hear the rest. The heat hit me first, as I approached the doorway, waves of it pressing against my skin, even through the chains that still dulled most of my abilities. Smoke burned my eyes and throat as I pushed through the entrance, calling Lily's name into the darkness. A faint cough answered from somewhere deeper inside, followed by a small, frightened voice. "Help! Please! Somebody help!" I followed the sound through a hallway filling rapidly with smoke, my vision blurring from both the heat and the sting in my eyes. I found her in what appeared to be a small common room, crouched near an overturned shelf, coughing violently, a section of the fallen shelf pinning her leg in place. "Lily," I said, dropping to my knees beside her, relief and terror crashing through me in equal measure. "I have you." "It hurts," she gasped, between coughs, tears streaking through the soot, already covering her face. "I can't move it." The dampening chains fought against every effort I made, but desperation is a powerful thing. I gripped the edge of the fallen shelf and pulled with everything I had left, feeling the metal cuffs burn hotter against my wrists as they strained to suppress strength they were never designed to fully contain in a moment like this. The shelf shifted, just enough. I pulled Lily free, ignoring the pain lancing through my arms, and gathered her against me as the ceiling above us groaned ominously, sections of it beginning to buckle from the heat. "Hold on to me," I said, and she wrapped her small arms around my neck without hesitation, trusting me completely, despite everything, despite the chains, despite every warning she must have heard whispered by adults around the base. I ran back through the hallway as debris began falling behind us, shielding her body with my own as best I could, ignoring the sharp pain of embers landing against my skin. We burst out of the entrance just as a section of the roof finally collapsed inward with a deafening crash. The crowd outside gasped collectively as we emerged, Lily coughing but alive in my arms, both of us covered in soot and smoke. Her mother rushed forward, sobbing with relief, pulling her daughter from my arms the moment we were clear of the building. I collapsed to my knees on the ground, exhaustion and pain finally catching up with me, the chains around my wrists scorched and warped from the strain I had put on them. For a long moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Dozens of eyes, adults who had feared me since the day I arrived, stared at me with expressions I could not quite read, somewhere between shock and something that might have been the very first flicker of doubt in everything they had assumed about me. Ethan arrived moments later, breathless from running, his rifle raised out of habit before he took in the scene fully, the collapsed building, the crying child safe in her mother's arms, and me, kneeling exhausted on the ground, with no intention of running or fighting. He lowered his weapon slowly. "She saved her," someone in the crowd said quietly, disbelief evident in their voice. "She went in after her." Dr. Bennett pushed through the gathered crowd moments later, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. She knelt beside me, checking the burns on my wrists and arms, with careful, professional hands, but her expression had changed from the cautious neutrality I had grown used to into something far more complicated. "Why?" she asked quietly, so only I could hear. "Why would you risk yourself like that?" I looked toward Lily, still held tightly in her mother's arms, alive because of a choice that had nothing to do with calculation or strategy, only instinct born from weeks of small kindnesses that had slowly chipped away at every wall I had built to survive. "Because she was kind to me when nobody else was," I said simply, "and I could not let that kindness end because of a fire I might have been able to stop." Bennett said nothing for a long moment, studying me with an expression I finally recognized, not fear, not suspicion, but something closer to reconsideration. Behind her, I could hear Major Voss's voice cutting through the crowd, demanding to know why I was outside my restraints, why nobody had stopped me, why the situation had been allowed to unfold the way it had. But for the first time since my capture, his voice was not the only one responding. "She saved my daughter," Lily's mother said fiercely, turning to face him directly, her voice trembling but resolute. "She ran into a burning building for a girl she had no reason to save. If you want to lock her away tighter after that, you can explain it to every family on this base yourself." Voss opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again, glancing around at the crowd of faces watching him, faces that no longer held the same easy agreement they might have offered him just an hour earlier. I sat there in the settling ash and smoke, exhausted, burned, and chained, but for the first time since I had been captured, I did not feel entirely alone in a world that had already decided what I was, before I ever had the chance to show them otherwise. They took me back to my cell that night, but something about the way they handled me had shifted, subtle but unmistakable. Ethan walked beside me instead of behind me, and though he still carried his weapon, his grip on it seemed more habit than genuine wariness. Dr. Bennett insisted on treating the burns along my arms herself, her hands gentle in a way they had not been during our earlier, more clinical examinations. Word of what happened in the housing sector spread quickly through the base. By morning, it seemed everyone had heard some version of the story: a girl trapped in a burning building, and the chained alien woman who broke free of her restraints not to escape, but to save her. Not everyone was convinced this changed anything. I overheard fragments of conversation from guards passing my cell, some sympathetic, others still deeply suspicious, wondering aloud whether the entire event had been some elaborate manipulation designed to earn trust before a larger, more dangerous plan unfolded. Major Voss was among the most vocal of these voices. 2 days after the fire, he called for a formal hearing, insisting that my broken restraints represented a serious security failure that needed to be addressed immediately, regardless of the circumstances that led to it. I was brought before a small assembly in one of the base's administrative buildings, a room with a long table where several senior officers and staff members sat, including Colonel Hale, who I had not seen since the day of my capture, Dr. Bennett, and Major Voss, along with a handful of others whose roles I did not fully understand. They kept me chained, of course, though the restraints they used this time were newer, stronger, clearly manufactured in response to how close my previous set had come to failing entirely under pressure. "Let the record show," Voss began, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone used to being obeyed without question, that the subject demonstrated the ability to overcome standard restraint protocols when sufficiently motivated. This confirms exactly the kind of risk this facility was warned about from the beginning. "The subject has a name," Dr. Bennett said quietly from her seat, not looking up from the notes in front of her. "And she used that ability to save a child's life, not to escape or cause harm." "That we know of," Voss countered. "We cannot ignore the possibility that this was calculated, a demonstration of trustworthiness designed to earn exactly this kind of leniency." Colonel Hale, who had remained silent until this point, finally spoke, his voice measured and calm, in a way that immediately drew the attention of everyone in the room. "Major, are you suggesting she orchestrated a fire that nearly killed a 9-year-old girl, purely as some kind of long-term strategy?" Voss hesitated, clearly aware of how that accusation sounded when stated plainly. "I am suggesting we cannot rule out manipulation, however unlikely the specifics." "I did not start the fire," I said, my voice steady, despite the tension in the room. "I did not know it was happening until the alarm sounded. I acted because a child I had come to know was in danger, and I could not stand by and do nothing while she was hurt." "And why?" Colonel Hale asked, turning his attention directly to me for the first time. "Should we believe that explanation, given everything your kind has done in the past?" This was the moment I had been avoiding since my capture, the question I had dodged through careful, incomplete answers during every previous conversation. But sitting in that room, having already risked everything to save Lily, hiding the full truth any longer, felt like a betrayal of the trust that small act had begun to build. "Because I am not responsible for what my kind did," I said quietly, then took a slow breath and began to explain, for the first time to anyone on this base, the truth of where I came from. I told them about the empire that had shaped my people into weapons before we were old enough to understand what was being taken from us. I told them about the neural restraints embedded in our minds, forcing compliance through pain that made refusal nearly impossible. I told them about the campaigns against the outer colonies, campaigns I had been forced to participate in, carrying horrors I never chose but could never fully separate myself from. I told them about the rare defect that allowed my own restraints to eventually fail, about the desperate flight through unclaimed space that led me, exhausted and out of options, to the very outpost where soldiers found me, and assumed the absolute worst, based on reports that had never once considered we might have been prisoners, rather than willing participants in our own atrocities. The room was silent when I finished, several faces around the table clearly struggling to reconcile this new information with everything they had been told to believe. "That is a convenient story," Voss said, though his voice carried less certainty than before. "It is not convenient," Bennett said sharply, surprising everyone including herself, judging by the way she straightened in her seat afterward. "Convenient would have been staying silent, and letting us continue believing whatever assumptions justified keeping her chained without question. She had no reason to tell us this, except that it happens to be true. Colonel Hale studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before finally speaking again. If this story can be verified, even partially, it changes the nature of this situation considerably. We are not in the business of imprisoning victims for crimes committed against their will. And if it cannot be verified, Voss pressed, then we continue as we have been, Hale said evenly. But I think, given recent events, we owe it to ourselves and to her to actually investigate, rather than simply assume. The hearing ended without a final decision, though something had shifted in the room by the time it concluded, a crack in the certainty that had governed every interaction I'd had with this base since my arrival. Over the following days, that crack continued to widen in small, unexpected ways. Ethan began speaking to me during my hour in the yard, hesitant questions at first, about my life before everything went wrong, about the world I had come from, about small, ordinary things that had nothing to do with weapons or warfare. Dr. Bennett's visits became less clinical and more conversational, her questions shifting from suspicious probing toward genuine curiosity about who I actually was beneath the fear that had defined my existence on this base. Even some of the guards who had once watched me with open hostility began offering small nods of acknowledgement as they passed my cell, gestures so small they might have gone unnoticed by anyone not desperately searching for signs of change. And Lily, once her burns had healed and her mother's initial panic had settled into quiet gratitude, returned to the fence during my exercise hour, this time without needing to hide from the guards at all. "My mom says I'm allowed to visit you now," she announced proudly, Grace and Ava trailing behind her, no longer needing to duck and hide the way they once had, as long as a guard is nearby. Ethan, standing not far away, offered a small smile at this, clearly having been informed of the new arrangement in advance. "I am glad," I said, and meant it more deeply than I had words to express. Not everyone on the base had changed their opinion of me, of course. Trust built over years of fear does not dissolve completely, because of one dramatic act of rescue and one difficult confession. Major Voss remained deeply skeptical, continuing to push for stricter oversight, even as evidence supporting my story slowly began to surface through channels I did not fully understand, scattered reports and fragments of intelligence that corroborated pieces of what I had described about the Empire and its methods. But for the first time since chains had first closed around my wrists, I found myself surrounded by more than just suspicion and fear. There were small kindnesses now, offered freely by people who had chosen, in their own quiet ways, to see past what they had been taught to expect. The chains remained, heavier and newer than before, a formality that Colonel Hale insisted still needed to remain in place while the investigation into my claims continued. But even chained, sitting in that small cell each night, with Lily's drawing still tucked safely beneath my cot, I felt something I had not felt in longer than I could remember. Something close to hope. 3 weeks passed before the sky above the base tore open with a warning nobody was prepared for. I was in the yard during my usual hour, Lily and Grace sitting cross-legged near the fence while Ava braided a small string bracelet she insisted on giving me despite my protests that I had nowhere to wear it, when the base's alert systems shifted into a pattern I had never heard before. Not the sharp, urgent tone of a fire or an accident, but a deep, rolling siren that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. Every soldier on the base went rigid at the sound. Ethan's hand flew to his radio, his expression shifting from casual conversation to sharp focus in an instant. "That's a perimeter breach alert," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. "That's not supposed to happen." I felt something cold settle in my stomach, a sensation I recognized immediately, though I had hoped never to feel it again on this world. I knew that particular pattern of alarm, or at least, I recognized the feeling it created, because I had felt something similar countless times before, back when the Empire's scanners first detected approaching threats. "Get the girls inside," I said sharply, all traces of casual conversation gone from my voice. "Now." Ethan did not question me. He herded Lily, Grace, and Ava away from the fence, guiding them quickly toward the nearest secure building, even as more alarms began sounding across the base. Soldiers running toward defensive positions, voices crackling urgently over radios. I remained in the yard, chained to the loop in the ground, watching the sky with a growing dread that settled deeper with every passing second. Colonel Hale appeared moments later, flanked by several officers, his expression grim as he approached my position. "Explain to me," he said without preamble, "why our long-range sensors just picked up 3 vessels entering the system that match no known human design, moving in a formation consistent with the reports you gave us weeks ago." My chest tightened. I had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that enough time had passed, that whatever remained of my previous captors had either given up searching or lost my trail entirely somewhere in the vastness of space. "They found me," I said quietly. "The Empire?" Hale asked. "A recovery unit, most likely. When one of us breaks their restraints and escapes, the Empire does not simply let that go. We represent resources they invested heavily in creating. They will not want word spreading that their control can fail." "And what exactly does a recovery unit intend to do once it arrives?" Hale asked, though something in his tone suggested he already suspected the grim answer. "Retrieve me, by whatever means necessary. If retrieval proves too difficult or too costly, they will attempt to eliminate me instead, along with anyone who might have learned too much from my presence here." Hale's jaw tightened at that. "Meaning this base. Meaning everyone on it," I confirmed. "I am sorry. I did not think they would follow this far, or that they would find me at all." For a long moment, Hale said nothing, staring toward the horizon, where the first signs of approaching ships were beginning to show as bright points of light, descending through the atmosphere far faster than any human vessel could safely manage. "How do we stop them?" he finally asked. "You likely cannot," I said honestly. "Not with conventional weapons. Their vessels carry defenses designed to withstand far greater firepower than this base possesses. Then what do you suggest?" I looked down at the chains, still wrapped tightly around my wrists, the same chains that had dulled my abilities since the day of my capture, the same chains that had nearly failed the night I ran into a burning building for a girl who had shown me kindness when nobody else would. "Take these off," I said, meeting his gaze directly, "and let me fight." Hale hesitated, the weight of that decision clearly warring with every instinct that had governed his approach to me since the moment I arrived. Around us, soldiers were scrambling into defensive positions, families were being ushered into shelters, and the descending lights in the sky were growing larger, closer, undeniable in their approach. "If I remove those chains," Hale said slowly, "and you turn against us instead, this entire base could be lost in minutes." "If you do not remove them," I countered, "this entire base will likely be lost regardless, because I will not be able to stop what is coming. And neither will your soldiers. Not against vessels built to overpower entire colonies." Dr. Bennett arrived at that moment, breathless from running, having clearly heard enough of the conversation to understand the stakes. "Colonel," she saved Lily without hesitation, without a moment's thought for her own safety. If there was ever a moment to trust her, this is it. Hale looked between the two of us, then toward the sky, where the descending ships had grown close enough now that their shapes were becoming visible. Sleek and angular, unmistakably not of human design. "Do it," he said finally, turning to the nearest soldier. "Remove her restraints, all of them." The soldier hesitated only a moment, before producing a key, moving quickly to unlock the cuffs around my wrists and ankles. The moment the chains fell away, I felt something shift inside me, power I had been forced to suppress for weeks rushing back all at once, sharp and almost overwhelming after so long being dulled. "Get everyone into shelter," I said, already moving toward the open field beyond the base's main gate. "Whatever happens next, they should not be exposed." The first vessel touched down just beyond the perimeter fence, its hull hissing as it settled, weapons ports along its sides already beginning to glow with charging energy. I recognized the design immediately, a standard recovery craft, built for exactly the kind of mission I now faced. The hatch opened, and a figure stepped out, tall and armored, carrying himself with the rigid confidence of someone who had done this many times before. I recognized the markings on his armor as belonging to the same division that had once controlled my own restraints, years ago, before everything changed. "Subject designation Naira," he called out, his voice amplified through his helmet speakers. "You are ordered to surrender for retrieval. Resistance will result in termination of yourself and any assets deemed to have been compromised by your presence." Behind me, I could hear the base's remaining defenses scrambling into position, soldiers taking cover, weapons aimed uselessly at a threat far beyond their capability to handle alone. "I will not be returning with you," I said, stepping forward to meet him in the open field between the vessel and the base's perimeter. "Then you understand the consequences," the commander said, raising a weapon of his own, one designed specifically to counter the abilities the Empire had given creatures like me. I did not wait for him to fire first. What followed was not a fight in any way the soldiers watching from the base would have expected. There was no gunfire exchanged in the way they understood warfare, no explosions rocking the ground beneath their feet. Instead, it was a battle fought on a level few humans present had ever witnessed firsthand, energy clashing against energy, forces bending and breaking in ways that defied simple explanation. I fought not with anger, though anger certainly fueled parts of me, but with a desperate need to protect something I had only recently allowed myself to value again: a small braided girl who had waved at me through a transport window, a friend who had brought me a blanket when nobody else offered warmth, a base full of people who had slowly, carefully, chosen to see past the fear that had defined my arrival among them. The recovery commander was strong, trained by the same brutal systems that had shaped me, but he fought for an empire that valued him only as a tool, while I fought for people who had begun, however cautiously, to see me as something more than a weapon. That difference mattered more than I expected. The battle stretched across long, brutal minutes, energy scarring the ground around us, both of us pushing past limits that would have broken lesser fighters entirely. But slowly, gradually, I began to gain ground, driven by a determination the commander simply did not possess, a reason to fight beyond mere duty or obligation. When it finally ended, the commander lay defeated in the scorched field, his vessel's remaining crew choosing retreat over further engagement once they witnessed the outcome of the confrontation. The two remaining ships that had accompanied the recovery vessel broke off entirely, rising back into the sky and disappearing beyond the atmosphere as quickly as they had arrived. I stood alone in the smoking field, exhausted beyond anything I had felt in years, watching the empty sky where the threat had finally retreated. Behind me, I heard footsteps approaching, cautious at first, then quickening into a run. I turned to find Lily sprinting across the field toward me, having apparently slipped away from whatever shelter she had been placed in, ignoring every instruction to stay safely hidden. "You're okay," she cried, throwing her arms around me despite the soot and exhaustion covering every inch of me. I knelt down, wrapping my arms around her carefully, feeling something loosen in my chest that had been tight since the moment those alarms first sounded. "I told you to stay in shelter," I said, though there was no real reprimand in my voice. "I wanted to make sure you were safe," she said simply, as though the danger to herself had never once crossed her mind. Colonel Hale approached moments later, along with Dr. Bennett, Ethan, and a growing crowd of soldiers and families who had witnessed enough of the confrontation from a distance to understand what had just happened. "They are gone," I confirmed, straightening slowly, despite the exhaustion weighing down every part of me. "For now, at least. I cannot promise they will not attempt this again eventually, but the immediate threat has passed." Hale studied me for a long moment, then looked down at the empty space on my wrists where the chains had once been. He did not immediately call for them to be reapplied. "You could have run," he said quietly. "The moment those chains came off, you had every opportunity to simply leave, to avoid the fight entirely, and disappear before that ship even landed." "I considered it," I admitted honestly, "for half a moment, but this is the first place since my escape where people looked past what I was forced to become, and saw who I actually am. I was not about to abandon that, or the people who gave it to me, no matter the cost." Bennett stepped forward, her expression carrying an emotion I had not seen from her before, something warmer than the careful professionalism she had maintained since our first meeting. "I think," she said, glancing toward Hale, "we owe her considerably more than a formal hearing at this point." Hale nodded slowly, seeming to reach a decision that had likely been forming since long before this confrontation ever began. "The restraints stay off," he said finally. "Permanently. Dr. Bennett, begin the paperwork to formally clear her status. I will handle command." Voss, who had arrived partway through this exchange, opened his mouth as though to argue, then closed it again, glancing at the scorched field, the retreating ships, and the exhausted but undeniably protective figure kneeling beside a young girl who trusted her completely. Whatever objections he might have still held, he chose, wisely, not to voice them in that moment. In the weeks that followed, life on the base settled into something I had never truly expected to experience again, something close to belonging. The formal investigation into my history concluded with enough corroborating evidence to fully support the story I had shared during that difficult hearing weeks earlier. Reports from other colonies, previously dismissed as isolated incidents, began to align with details only someone who had lived through the Empire's methods could have known. I was given quarters, small but genuinely comfortable, no longer separated from the rest of the base by reinforced walls and constant surveillance. Ethan became something close to a friend, often finding excuses to stop by during quiet moments to talk about nothing in particular. Dr. Bennett continued her research, though our conversations shifted increasingly toward genuine curiosity rather than clinical assessment. And Lily, along with Grace and Ava, remained exactly as they had always been from that very first wave through a transport window, unafraid, unguarded, and endlessly, stubbornly kind. I often thought back to those early days, chained in a cold cell, watched through glass by people who had already decided what I was, before I ever had a chance to prove otherwise. It would have been easy, in that darkness, to believe that fear was simply the natural response the entire world owed someone like me. But 3 small girls, unburdened by the weight of old reports and inherited suspicion, had looked at me and seen something worth being kind to, long before any adult on that base was willing to consider the same possibility. Everyone had feared the chained alien woman when I first arrived, and given everything they had been told, given every warning etched into their reports and briefings, I understood why. Fear, in a world shaped by old wars and older wounds, often felt like the only reasonable response to the unknown. But it was not fear that changed my fate on that base. It was not weapons, or diplomacy, or even the battle I fought beneath a sky full of returning enemies. It was a folded drawing, pushed through a gap in a fence. It was a worn blanket, offered freely on a cold night. It was a small hand, pressed against mine through metal bars, asking for nothing in return. The girls had welcomed me quietly, long before the rest of the world found the courage to do the same, and in doing so, they gave me something no chain could ever take away again. They gave me a reason to believe that even someone shaped by war and fear could still find a place where she belonged.